So I'm standing here in the traditional place of the tomb of Samuel. Samuel is one of my favorite prophets in the Bible, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, Samuel he started out with an interesting story. His mom leaves him at the tabernacle to serve the priest. And so he's not quite orphaned because his mom comes back and visits once a year. But as soon as he's old enough to be able to feed himself, basically, as soon as he's weaned, she leaves him at this tabernacle and he just begins to serve in the house of God. And he does whatever is needed to be done. And so he's helping Eli and Eli's sons and doing whatever is needed. Now at the time, the tabernacle was located at a place called Shiloh. And that was the place of the tabernacle for 369 years. It was there in Shiloh. And Samuel comes to this place and he's serving, and he's a young boy. Could be 10 years old, might be just a little bit older than that, but he's still a young boy. And he goes and he lays down where the Ark of the Covenant was. Now, if you know anything about the tabernacle, that's illegal. The Ark of the Covenant was in the Holy of Holies. It was in the most holy place in the tabernacle. And so it was not okay for someone to come and to lay down where the Ark of the Covenant was. But this is what Samuel does. He goes into the Holy of Holies, he lays down and goes to sleep, and he hears this voice calling him, Samuel, Samuel. Now, Samuel didn't know how to hear from God yet. He hadn't had the opportunity of really listening to the voice of God, so he didn't know what was going on. So he runs over to Eli and says, Eli, yes, you called me. And Eli says, no, I didn't call you. Go back and lay down. And so he goes back into the place of the ark and he lays back down and he hears again, Samuel. And so he gets up and he runs off to go talk to Eli again. Eli, you called me. He goes, no, I didn't call you. Go back and lay down. And so he goes back and lays down. And this time, Eli realizes there's something going on here. And so he tells him, Samuel, this time when you go back and lay down, it's not me that's calling you. This must be the voice of God. And so when he calls you again, I want you to say, yes, Lord, your servant listens. And so he goes back and he goes back to the place of the holy place where the ark is, and he lays back down and he hears the voice again, Samuel, Samuel. And he stands up and he says, yes, Lord, speak, for your servant is listening. And then the voice of God begins to speak to him and begins to tell him what's going to happen to Eli and what's going to happen to his sons. And he wakes up the next morning and Eli is like, you need to tell me everything that was told to you. And he's like, I don't want to say this, because he didn't want to tell Eli this bad news. And yet Eli says, no, you must tell me what was told to you. And so he begins to tell him what God had told him in the night about the judgment that was coming upon Eli because he refused to correct his sons, to discipline his sons. And Eli recognizes this is the voice of the Lord. Now that happened when Samuel was a young child. But there was a period of time, there was a long period of time, because about a chapter later in Scripture we read, it says that all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was a prophet of the Lord, that he'd been established as a prophet of the Lord, and the Lord let none of his words fall to the ground. Some interesting points here. Between that experience when he was in the tabernacle until it says that all of Israel recognized him as a prophet of the Lord, it was about 25 years. There was a 25-year period where Samuel continued to serve in the tabernacle. He'd had this astounding experience in the holy place, heard the voice of God, and yet he continues to serve and continues to do what he's supposed to do. 25 years later, he's now almost 40 years old. He's in his 30s at this point in time, possibly just right at 40 years old. And he is now established. And he goes and he sets up in Mizpah. Now, Mizpah is a city that he was from, that his family was from. And so Samuel sets up there, and all of Israel would come to him, and he would judge them, which means that they would come to him with difficult cases that they couldn't understand based off of what they'd been given in the Mosaic law. They didn't know how to handle the situation, and so they would come to him for him to make a decision, to hear from God, to let them know how they were supposed to respond, what they were supposed to do. He was basically the leader, and as the leader, the role of Samuel as the leader was to hear the voice of God and to help the people recognize what it was that God was saying. And so people are coming to him at Mizpah, and he would travel from Mizpah to Ramah to Gilead. And he would go to these different places, and he would travel kind of in this circuit at different times of the year, and he would meet with different people in different places, and he would judge. And it gets to the end of his life, and his sons are not the best of leaders. Now, this is an interesting point. We talk sometimes about the sins of the fathers being visited to the children, and how something that's going on in our generational line, once it happens in our generational line, it's almost easier for it to continue to happen in the further generations. And so if you do something and you establish a pattern of sinning, then it's going to be easier for your children to fall into that same pattern of sinning, and your children's children to fall into that same pattern of sinning. So that's again, I mean, that's not a DNA issue. That's not a genetic issue. That's a spiritual issue. The iniquity of the parents are visited on the children. It doesn't mean that they're forced to sin. It just means it's easier for them to make that choice. But it's not just the bloodline. It's the influences that are in your life. Because Samuel was not the blood child of Eli, and yet he does exactly the same thing. Not to the same extent, but exactly the same thing that Eli did. He was not a good father to his children. He did not discipline them, and they didn't end up being the same person that he was. Eli was known as a father. He was a good priest. He was just, he was kind, but he refused to deal with his children, and so his children were falling into sin, and God had to judge his children because of that, and remove the priestly line to one of his cousins instead of one of his children. And so the priestly line of Aaron, going from firstborn to firstborn to firstborn, was broken at that point in time. Now Samuel is raised up by Eli, and he gets to the end of his life. He now has children. He's raised up his children, and his sons are not as wise. They're not as just, and the people don't trust them. Don't trust them for various reasons. The same issue that Eli had, Samuel has. Now, I'm going to take this one more place, but let me finish with Samuel really quick. Samuel gets to the end of his life, and that's when he establishes Saul as king and then David as king. And in his retirement speech, he comes to the nation of Israel. He says, guys, take a look at my life. Take a look at my ministry. Is there anything that you can see in my life, in my history, and in my ministry that was not just, that was not honest, that was not above the line? And they couldn't find anything. There was a matter of integrity where Samuel had such great integrity, and it was astounding what he accomplished in his lifetime. Now, let's go to one more story, because I started talking about the sins of the children being visited and how it's not just necessarily the bloodline, but those that you influence. Because this is going to tell you a lot about those that you allow to mentor you and those that you mentor, and how this can get passed on, not just in bloodlines, but in spiritual bloodlines as well. Because Samuel has the same issue that Eli does, and if we keep on looking, Samuel's prodigy, if you will, was David. There was quite a relationship, and when you take a look at David and Samuel, you'll see them interacting again and again and again after Samuel calls him out, prophesies over him, and anoints him with oil and calls him the king. They continue to have this relationship, even at one point in time when David is trying to run for his life, he goes to Samuel to be with him there. David ends up with the exact same issue that Eli and Samuel had. He does not punish his children. He does not hold them responsible for their choices. So you have Absalom that that ends up being in this rebellious place. You have his son that rapes his sister and he doesn't do anything about it. You have his children not being raised up in obedience, not having the same integrity. He was so busy in ministry that he didn't really raise his children well. And because of that, the legacy was cut off after his generation. Solomon was not able to finish well. He started out amazing, but at the end of his life, he ends up worshiping other gods. And one of the keys is the lack of discipline. Eli, lack of discipline for his sons. Samuel, a lack of discipline for his sons. David, a lack of discipline for his sons. We realize this issue is a major issue. Well, let's go back to Samuel. Being able to finish well, being able to come to the end of his life, the end of his ministry, and to be able to say, look at my life. Is there anything that I've done wrong? What a legacy to leave. We talk about finishing well. Samuel is one that finished well. If you look at the end of Judges, right before the book of 1 Samuel starts, the last thing that the book of Judges says, that everybody did what was right in their own eyes, that they were just without restraint. They were just doing whatever they wanted to do. And Samuel shows up and he begins to establish this place where the people of God are hearing the voice of God and are anchoring their lives around the voice of God. He's judging Israel. People are coming to him to hear what God has to say. He's established as one who speaks for God throughout all of the land. And people now have this focus. He is the one that established the schools of the prophets. Right, he creates these places where the prophets would come together and they would begin to learn how to hear from God. They would encourage one another. They would hear corporately. They would spend time in the presence of God, going after God to hear what God had to say. And it begins to change the spiritual water table of the whole nation. Because at the end of his life, Samuel leaves a nation that has turned a corner. They've gone from a place where they're mainly worshiping the false gods that were there, that God had warned them, when you get into the land and you begin to establish in the land, don't go and worship the gods that the people that I've removed from before you have worshiped. And yet the people did it, and they're in this place of unrestraint. And now he starts his ministry, his public ministry at Mizpah when he becomes the judge. And people come together, and the first thing he says is, hey, if you're going to serve the Lord, serve the Lord. Get rid of your idols. And the people do. They turn their hearts back to God, and they begin to focus again on God. And then they establish a king where there is a central government. Instead of everybody doing what's right in their own eyes, they're now established under a king. And Samuel wrote out what were the requirements of a king. What was a king supposed to do? What wasn't the king supposed to do? He actually followed what was written in the book of Deuteronomy, where when Moses was prophesying over the nation of Israel, saying there's going to come a time where you're going to demand a king, and when that happens, there's some requirements for a king, and there's some things that they're allowed to do as a king. And so you need to have this written down. Samuel did exactly that. He got it written down. He got it established, and he leaves the nation in a better place than when he started, from doing whatever's right in your own eyes to going to the place where the people are following the Lord. Now that is a legacy that is beautiful. I love the prophet Samuel.